He will not
So our second conversation then, we're staying with Arabic, we're going back a bit. Julia Bray is the Abdulaziz Saud Al-Babtain Laudian Professor of Arabic. She taught Arabic and Arabic literature in Manchester, Edinburgh, St Andrews, and then in the University of Paris 8, from where she came in 2012 here to the Laudian chair, the first woman to hold the chair since it was founded in 1636. And she will be in conversation about her research with Professor Jennifer Guest.
So you've brought some really, I think, really fascinating materials to talk about today, sort of picture poems, and I wonder if maybe you could start by kind of talking us through how they work, these texts that you're working on, and how it is that you actually came to be working on them.
Just before I came here, there was a question raised on Middle East medievalists, which was a forum for asking questions about things and people supplying information. And the question was, are there such things as picture poems in Arabic? And a learned librarian from an American university said, well, I don't know about that, but there is this book that came out in Oxford a few years ago by Kamal Abu Deeb called Dīwān al-Tadbīj, and it seems to have picture poems in it. When I was in France, we didn't have any money, so I couldn't do anything about it. But as soon as I got here, there was money. So I asked the librarian to get the book, and it was got and in the library in record time. And when I looked at it, I saw that there were these wonderful reproductions of various manuscripts, but mainly a manuscript in Manchester. But that there was something funny about them, because clearly they didn't really work as page things. And being still in the money, I ordered from Manchester, what had not been possible for Abu Deeb a few years before, a digitized off-print of the manuscript in question. And by the simple device of printing them off and sticking them together, I realized that they were scrolls. They had originally been meant to be scrolls. So from a different manuscript, you can see what happens when they are books. They look like this, and there is a certain problem with seeing how they connect and how they work. So if you want to look at that in its book form, if you then stick them together, you get something which is perfectly comprehensible as a scroll. And these are both from the Gotha manuscript, which anybody can look at for free online.
Ah.
It's a very beautiful manuscript, and it is available free online in accordance with the admirable policy of German universities and libraries of putting all their stuff up online for the furtherment of scholarship.
That's really, that is wonderful and very fascinating. I wonder if, I don't unfortunately read Arabic, and there may be some other people in the room in the same boat. Can you sort of talk in general terms about how this format works for those of us that don't have this type of sort of picture poem genre in our own languages? How does one, sort of generally speaking, trace a path through the poem, through the image, and how does this generate poetry?
It's a genre which seems to have been invented by the author of these scrolls. He came from Spain and attached himself to Saladin in Egypt at the beginning of his career as a physician. Saladin was not a well man, and he had lots of physicians. He also, increasingly during his reign, gathered poets around him who celebrated his battles in sort of rather analytic detail, which makes them very useful. And al-Jilyānī must have felt that he needed to do something different. So as well as writing that kind of poem, he also wrote this kind of poem. And you read them by following the instructions, which in the case of this manuscript are actually written on the figures. In the case of other manuscripts, you may not get the instructions on the figures, but in the form of separate little, as it were, booklets. So here, for example, are some instructions, and then poems written out with the rhyme letter that you can see here. And the idea is that following the instructions, you can go up and down that tree finial, for example, completing the short lines with the bits that you get in the middle. So that's a sort of parlour game, but at the same time, you can, by working your way between figures, following the instructions and the colour coding, you can derive a set of other poems from the primary poem that is visible here. So there is an interweaving on the page, and there is a further sort of weaving that takes place as you weave fresh poems from the script that you're given. And how it goes up and down, well, if you look at this, there are arrows penciled on here that show you how we did it as a group. We wanted to be sure that the instructions actually worked, and so there is some proof of it.
So you can sort of, essentially by tracing a path through all of these geometric figures.
Yes, and you can see that sometimes you sort of go round, up, round. These things that look like a roundabout actually are a roundabout.
And the colour coding?
The colour coding works to mark off nodes where you can start deriving a new poem from the old poem, and particularly to mark off rhymes. There's also a change of metre generally. As you move on to a new set of rails, you move on to a new metre.
No, so this is something I'm curious about. So not knowing much about classical Arabic forms of poetry, are there sort of features of the script or of the sort of poetic forms current at the time, the sort of rhyme and metre in use, that lend themselves to this sort of system, or that are an integral element of this sort of system?
Well, since Al-Jilyānī came from Spain, where new metres and verse forms were beginning to be characteristic of the literature, you might have thought that he would use the freedoms that those new forms gave to make things easy for himself. But in fact, he is very insistent in his accompanying commentaries on these poems that he sticks to strict monometre with no allowable, let alone unallowable defects in it, and he sticks to the strict rules of rhyme, which forbid, among other things, any repetition within a very large number of rhymes. So he makes things as hard for himself as he possibly can by sticking to absolutely classical formats.
So it sounds like each of these works or sort of series of poems is really a tour de force of poetic skill, like it's his way to kind of show off.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And this is an aspect of Saladin's court that had not been suspected before. It was not thought to be such an amusing place.
Yeah, I'm kind of, it sounds quite fun to me. So, I mean, you've mentioned a bit about the original poet and his setting. Is there anything that we can tell from the manuscript history of this type of poem and the sort of different manuscripts that survive about how either the genre might have been transmitted over time, or how people might have continued to create in this sort of form if they did? Or
it's all very much in progress at the moment. It really needs a team of people to work on it. The foundational work was done by Kamal Abu Deeb, but since he looked at 3 main manuscripts, 2 further manuscripts, one of which was catalogued already in the 19th century, and that's this one, the Go-To one, have become available online. There's the Khalidiyya one in Jerusalem, which is now available through the Hill Manuscript Library. They are of different dates. The not quite so beautiful Manchester manuscript, of which you already have an example down there, seems to date from about a century after Al-Jilyānī's death. And so probably does the Khalidiyya one in Jerusalem. The others appear to be later, so this is already valuable. And there is a body of scholarship previously scattered, which, if you put it together, suggests a number of things about these manuscripts and about related forms. We still don't know whether Al-Jilyānī invented this form entirely himself, and if so, whether he invented it in Spain or in the East. We do know that in later centuries in Spain, we find something similar. And sometimes this is buried evidence. There was a poet called Ibn Asim who died in the mid-1400s, whose work was published in the first half of the 20th century. And it contains poems that are interwoven in this way and that are colour-coded for unpicking in this way. But the edition in which it was published was black and white, and there are teeny little footnotes in which the editors say, these were originally in colour, and to show you where the colour was, we have used single or double brackets. And so this passed completely unregarded, because it was all in black and white. So we may hope that there is more stuff like this lurking. There's a good body of 20th century Arabic scholarship about the copying of such manuscripts under the Ottomans, and about the production of stuff like this in the Ottoman domains, quite widespread, sometimes much more elaborate, sometimes multilingual, sometimes not just poetry, but an interweaving of different sorts of discourse or knowledge or whatever. And one example was one of the earliest Arabic printed as opposed to lithographed books, and it appeared within a very short space in the 19th century in Cairo, Aleppo, and I think Calcutta. And all of this is, I think, suggestive of something which is not marginal. So these are all creative uses of a tradition, which may or may not be a direct tradition. What we have, which excited me very much, is evidence that this particular poem, that one, for example, and the other ones by Al-Jilyānī, had a direct influence. And that is the Dīwān of a Moroccan poet called Ibn al-Ḥājj that was published in the 1990s and that I came across by chance in Stanford. He went on pilgrimage at the end of the 18th century, taking his time to stop off in places where there were literati, such as Egypt, in order to drink at the springs. And when he came back, he wrote for his master, the future ruler of Morocco, a series of poems which the edition tells us were originally in colour, but the edition is black and white. And the edition tells us that it gives us the actual poems as well as rather sort of squitty pictures of the images that they were originally enclosed in. And one of them is exactly the same as this tree in its form. The poem is different, but it's in the same metre. And I think that he met the man who was sent from Gotha to buy manuscripts for the Gotha library. This one was bought in Cairo and sent back in 1807, and I think that our Ibn al-Ḥājj must have seen it before it got crated and sent off. So this is the proof, which is not very clear in that reproduction, and still less so in my handheld photo. Now, there are also other things that are very similar. The Paris manuscript of the Al-Jilyānī oeuvre has copies of the actual poems, but it also has experimental things where the scribe was trying to do something similar, and sometimes doing something similar on the same principles, but sometimes trying to apply these principles to a different subject matter. Not so much a secular panegyric as a religious panegyric, or maybe prayer, devotional, magical thing. And this is a late manuscript, 17th, 18th century, and it fits in very much with the environment of this kind of half magical, half devotional manuscript that we get at this time. They're very well known, and you will all have seen quite a lot of examples of them. And we get things like this, which are obviously working on the same sort of principle. This popped up in, I think, at the end of the 19th century. The great Arab Jesuit editor, Sheikho, published this and some related figures in al-Nashriq, his journal. I'm told by Feras Krimsti that the actual manuscripts are in the Berlin Staatsbibliothek. I haven't had time to check that. They have been reproduced throughout the 20th century without acknowledgement by people writing on later periods of Arabic poetry. So they're not sourced, they're not related to anything. Nobody has tried to relate them to anything, but they obviously do relate to this tradition. And finally, if I can just add one more thing to this tradition, James White, who got his DPhil here last summer, is a Persianist as well as an Arabist, and he has been working on Persian picture poetry. And he has been working on an unpublished 18th century Dīwān of a Persian poet who lived in India. And he sends me a description of a picture poem by this person, which obviously follows both very similar principles to Al-Jilyānī's poems, but also the magical devotional trend. So this seems to be something that branches out in several directions.
Thank you. That's really fascinating, and I think there would be, I'm curious to hear more about possible multilingual examples or how this sort of form might cross over language or script. But I think we should open it up to more general questions first. So if anybody has any, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any general questions?
Julia, do you know if this was common among other peoples? Or could there be influence from European languages or from Latin or Greek? Or?
That's one of the things that I have looked at and asked other people about. I think that the tradition in languages in which you can separate the letters tends to be rather different. The examples that I've seen are much more sort of in straight lines, because you can do that with that kind of script. And then, of course, there are picture poems which are in the shape of tombs or urns and things like that. Direct influence, I'm not sure about.
Well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of related to that, I was trying to think if in my own tradition, in sort of Japanese or possibly Chinese poetry, there's anything at all similar. And if anybody knows of anything, I'd be very excited. But I haven't come across anything really that looks anything like this. I have seen some examples in Chinese poetry of, as you say, they're sort of distinct characters. So if you do a sort of complex grid layout, you can create a sort of figure made of Chinese characters that will generate a very large number of poems by reading in different directions or patterns. There are some probably medieval examples of that. There also are sort of palindrome poems that are a big thing in both China and Japan and in both languages and scripts. But I mean, this is amazing, and I've never seen anything this complex. So if anyone has something like this from their own tradition, that would be, yeah.
Well, Sanskrit has a tradition of picture poetry, and it's quite early, and it's well enough known in practice to generate a lot of discussion among literary theorists, whether it's real poetry or not. Because normally the kind of linguistic tricks and cleverness that you need to generate these things sort of remove any sort of emotional content to the verse, and it's just gymnastics. But it's quite an early tradition. And the pictures are maybe not quite as neat as some of them that are here, but they're a standard list of the kind of objects that you can draw. And you construct your verse, and of course the spacing is important, because you have common letters, if you go out with spokes and circles and so on. So there is a tradition from India.
Are there illustrations that I could look at?
I don't know. In some of the major poetry books, the editor will try to put them into a diagrammatic form. They're not at all attractive, compared to these things, because they're printed. But I don't know if in manuscripts there are nicer examples. It might be easy to find out, but I don't know.
Yeah, I have a follow-on question, which is precisely about the language and the themes. I mean, can you say something about that? Is it kind of shorn of emotion or not, or how would these compare to more sort of conventionally shaped poems in terms of their themes and language and so forth?
The text of the poems, I think, has barely been studied yet, but there are advantages, poetic advantages to writing in this form. So one figure that I have read, and which is not actually read in Abu Deeb's edition, is this tree finial, which works on the principle of adding a vowel, and then adding a syllable, and then 2 syllables, then 3 syllables, starting at the longer end and working your way up to the shorter end, and then using the spine, which has got the complete metre. And of course, this works anaphorically. So it's a praise poem, and because of these repetitions, it acquires a sort of liturgical quality almost, and a magical quality because you are making a new poem at the same time. And a poem that is symmetrical to this if you were to write it down. So I think in terms of what the poetry does, it may be that some of the poetry is banal and some of it is interesting like that, but there are definitely things that you can do with this kind of figure while remaining within the bounds of classical poetry that you could not probably do so easily within conventional poetic layout.
I wanted to ask a question that was related to that, but also further on the particular patterns themselves. I know you've already said that the text itself hasn't been sufficiently worked on. Does that mean you don't yet have a sense of maybe what the product of all that is, whether it's a question of a tour de force of riffing and moving on, or do you have a sense that by the time you complete this, that there is actually a product which is more than the sum of the parts? That's one question.
Well, shall I answer one question and then you can ask me another one? You could, if you were to use the printouts and you were to use Abu Deeb's edition, get an approximation to that, because what Al-Jilyānī did was supply a reading of the poems taken out of the boxes, as it were, so that you can read them without going through the figures. So if you put the two together, you can do it without going through contortions. But this is fairly dense stuff, and with the problems of sticking the scrolls together and thinking about the context, that hasn't yet been done. Clearly the process must be important, or why bother?
The other question was simply, do you have any sense or idea or knowledge about the actual choice of these figures, the tree, the star, the circles? Is there, do you know why these choice to intercalate in this text?
There may be obvious common symbolism attached to things like the dynastic tree, the circle of justice, and so on. But why Al-Jilyānī chose to do them in this particular way, we don't know. And as for deciphering that tree, I have no idea, because that's all shaggy and peculiar. So that's very much something that remains to be looked at. The relationship of this kind of visual material to visual materials of the Ayyubid period. There are obvious things in common, but we must bear in mind that all the manuscripts are later. The earliest ones are early Mamluk, and the others are probably mid-Ottoman. So we may not be looking at something completely.
This is just completely bizarre.
Would you think that Saladin was impressed?
According to Al-Jilyānī, he was very impressed.
Well, I think we're impressed. And we're impressed by both research conversations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.